Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Elizabeth Holmes. A wide-ranging bill in the North Carolina legislature would change a host of election laws. The 37-page document proposes new rules for so-called never-resident voters, allows for more secrecy around campaign donations, and more clearly spells out what to do about voters who cast ballots early but die before Election Day. WRAL state government reporter Paul Spey has been covering the issue for our NC Capitol team, and he joins us today. As a reminder, this is being recorded on Friday, June 26th. For the latest on the bill, be sure to check out the NC Capitol section on our website, WRAL.com. There is a bill in the North Carolina legislature that would change election laws in several different ways. There's been some reporting on voters who have died and if their votes should count or not. And I think that's where we should kind of start here, because that's kind of been the big talker in our newsroom.
Right. This week, we saw the State Elections Board consider whether or not to throw off the Wake County Elections Board, two members who in 2024 had allowed 3 dead people's ballots to count. Now, was that have to do with the elections bill? Well, people say that there's a wide-ranging bill, as you mentioned, in the legislature right now that would address this. But that was the big drama this week, was like, well, will the Republican-controlled State Board of Elections throw 2 Democrats off the Wake County Board of Elections? And that's what everybody was watching. They were basically given a talking to, essentially.
Okay.
They were told, don't do that again. They were not thrown off. And the issue was, when should a ballot stop counting?
Right.
It begs the question of, well, when does an election start? Does it start when absentee ballots are sent out? That's, weeks in advance of an election. Does it start when someone actually signs off on a ballot and turns it in, or does it start Election Day? The man who made a complaint against these Wake County Election Board members alleged that they had broken a rule that requires registered voters to participate, that if you're not registered, you cannot participate. And he said, well, because they were dead, right, at the time of Election Day, then they were not registered, and therefore these board members in Wake County broke the law. They should be thrown off. Well, they didn't agree with that. The 2 Wake County Democrats argued that, well, when these people did cast their ballots, they were registered to vote. And they said the state law is vague on when someone needs to be alive. Now, some people disagree with that, but that's what they argued. They said, and it got pretty emotional, actually. In one of those 3 cases, the person who voted was a cancer patient. She was 18 or 19. She'd never voted before. She cast her ballot. She died before Election Day. And one of the Wake County Democrats said during this hearing, like, he cried when he heard this woman's testimony, when he heard this case, that it's hard to vote against counting that ballot when you hear someone's story like that. And so we saw little bits of humanity there. It wasn't just a legal argument on both sides, but people were saying, like, hey, how do I say no in a case like that? And so that led to, like I said, a broader discussion of what the law says and what can be done about it.
Yeah, and it seems like the law, I guess, it may be pretty vague if there has been this back and forth. What exactly, I guess, you kind of went through it, but what exactly does it say about something like this?
Right. So it says that state election officials, county election officials, I should say, because they're the ones counting the ballots, are not allowed to count ineligible voters. But voters who, if they were alive and registered when they voted, then maybe their ballots should count. The law was actually written at a time when everyone voted on Election Day. But over the years in North Carolina, we've expanded early voting and absentee voting. Those are some of the most popular ways that people vote in North Carolina now. But the state law doesn't specifically have a deadline or specifically say you have to be alive on the first Tuesday in November for an election. And so this election bill aims to clarify that. But I think that's interesting. The lack of specificity has led to these debates over when does an election start? Because a lot of people start voting before election day.
Right. Exactly. And then you hear this story about an 18, 19-year-old who wants to cast that ballot, have it count, and then dies before election day. I'm sure that pulled on the heartstrings and thought about, made people think about those other circumstances.
And, we've heard similar stories like this before in our reporting in North Carolina. If I'm not mistaken, years ago we heard of someone whose spouse died and they were intending to vote. And so their spouse voted for them. And you can't do that. You get in trouble for that. But occasionally you run into those stories of people wanting to vote because it on someone's behalf or wanting their family members' vote to count because it meant so much to them. And I guess that's a good thing, right? When people want to participate in the process, I guess, that doesn't mean we should count all these ballots, but, I appreciate the sentiment, certainly.
Yeah. So as lawmakers are maybe trying to narrow this down to address certain circumstances like this, what are, chamber leaders saying about this?
Well, first of all, the wide-ranging elections bill still hasn't even made it to the House floor. It's originated in the House, hasn't even gotten to the House floor. They've amended it several times. We don't know what's going to happen to that bill. We asked Senator Berger in the other chamber, like, hey, when this ultimately gets to you, are you going to support it? And he was like, I don't even know what would be supporting at this point. It seems to change moment by moment. I'm not going to weigh in. But they did say, both House Speaker Destin Hall and Senate Leader Phil Berger, two Republicans, said they think from now on, if it isn't already clear, that you should be alive on Election Day for your vote to count.
Interesting. And so this isn't the only thing that this bill would cover. It's wide-ranging. Let's talk about never residents. For people who have never heard of that term when it comes to elections, what are they and how would this bill address those residents or never residents?
Right. Those are people that are U.S. citizens, right? So they're eligible to vote, and they're born to parents, one of whom is from North Carolina, but they've never lived in the U.S. Think about like military brats, if you will, or religious missionaries. This was tailored to them back when it was written, and it for years it had bipartisan support. But it recently came up in a very close race in our state Supreme Court here in North Carolina back in 2024. Oh, gosh, there was a race that went on for months. They counted ballots for months after the election between Republican Jefferson Griffin and Democrat Allison Riggs. And these never residents and their ballots came up because the race was, they were separated by only a few dozen votes. And so Republicans advocating for Jefferson Griffin said, hey, we shouldn't allow these votes in, And to be clear, we don't know how these people would have voted. And I doubt that either campaign would have known either. But they made the argument that, hey, if you've never lived here, then how would you, what stake do you have in our laws and our elections? And so they think that should change.
That's interesting. This bill would also give the state auditor some more duties. And I feel like this is something that we have talked about, but the office has always had the ability to conduct post-election audits. So how would this change things?
Right. So first of all, the state auditor is Republican Dave Bullock. He took over he was the first Republican in almost 2 decades, I believe, to win the election. And he already has the power to audit elections. This would put a statutory requirement that he look over the voter rolls over a certain period of time. So rather than waiting for him to get around to it when he has time, he would be obligated to do so.
So I assume this would be to improve election integrity.
Well, that's what they say, but a lot of people are suspicious of the motivations behind this, and it led to lots of protests at the legislature this week in downtown Raleigh. And the people behind this bill wanted to be clear that Bullock would not be able, under this bill, to stop the certification of elections. That's something people are worried about. Could this guy who's an elected official, a Republican, come in and just halt everything that's happening if he doesn't like the way that the votes are trending? But that would not be the case. The elections would still be overseen by the county elections boards and the state elections boards, which he does appoint people to. But it would give the auditor new powers to look into processes at the state level or individual counties, just to make sure that they're counting the ballots accurately. So we'll see where this goes. Our reporters have seen Executive Director Sam Hayes, the State Elections Board Executive Director, down there talking to people about ways that he thinks the elections law should be changed, just to make things more efficient. It remains unclear whether, like I said, whether it would even get to the floor. They've changed this thing so many times, this bill, that who knows what the final outcome will be. But Senator Leader Phil Berger has said he has an interest in potentially shortening the early voting period. I don't know if they'll ultimately end up putting that in this bill. That's one way a lot of people vote. But it sounds like a lot of work still left to be done.
Interesting. For folks who are maybe new to North Carolina and haven't caught up with election news here, has there been any kind of strong history in North Carolina of election fraud or a need for more oversight?
Well, the most famous case was back in like 2018, I believe it was, and Congressional District 9 between Dan McCready and current Congressman Mark Harris. At the time, there was an operative for Mark Harris who was breaking election laws that had to deal with like absentee ballots and things like that. They had to redo that election, ultimately redoing it, and with Republican Dan Bishop beating Democrat Dan McCready. Bishop's now gone. Mark Harris has since won a new election. He's back in. That's the most famous case, but otherwise we don't see, and election officials have not found widespread fraud, especially voter impersonation. One thing that people worry about, like, oh, can you go impersonate someone else? We don't see that. For the most part, we see people who vote not knowing that they're ineligible. For instance, people who have been in jail, they're felons, they don't have the right to vote anymore in North Carolina, or people who are non-citizens. They occasionally show up. They think, perhaps because they have a green card or something, maybe they're eligible and they're not. But that happens in, very small cases. We have not seen instances where those incidents would have flipped an election in North Carolina.
Interesting. So you said that this bill has changed so much. What are you looking for next when it comes to this very wide-ranging bill that is constantly changing?
Well, it's hard to say what the contents will be. What I'm looking for is how fast can they get it done. There seem to be a lot of disagreements, and yet they're sort of on a deadline. The state elections board and the county elections boards have deadlines for putting things on the ballots and then sending ballots out to people fairly early. Those absentee ballots go out, and I believe earlier mid-September. And so in order for them to get all their ducks in a row, keep in mind, there are a lot of logistical hurdles here to figure out what's going on the ballot in every district, not just every county, but every district. And then, getting them out there and mailing them out, it's a long process. And I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there's a deadline that they would need to meet, the lawmakers, in order to change the law for it to go into effect this year. So we're watching and waiting to see if, Speaker Hall and Senate Leader Berger will have some sort of agreement on what the election law changes should be, because if they don't come to an agreement on those soon, the current laws will likely remain in place.
Right. And of course, this is important because we have midterms.
Of course.
Coming
right.
up.
Those elections coming up.
Yeah.
And people have seen those ads for probably everywhere.
Exactly. So I guess, as you said, the clock is kind of ticking to see if these things will go into motion before North Carolina is really on the national stage when it comes to, the Senate race and other races here. So a lot to look out for.
That's right. So, and then ballots, like I said, you can sign up in North Carolina. Anybody can ask for a mail-in ballot or an absentee ballot that they call it. You don't need a reason. In some states, you have to be sick or out of town or whatever. North Carolina, anybody can request one. So it'll be interesting to see. One of the biggest races in the country is here for the Senate seat being vacated by Republican Tom Tillis. Races between Roy Cooper, Michael Whatley. Democrats need to make up 3 seats in order to balance out the Senate. They would pretty much, if they don't win North Carolina, they won't make up those 3 seats. Roy Cooper probably offers their best chance. Meanwhile, Republicans want to keep those 3 to keep their control of the Senate. So a lot of money will be spent here on ads that will be on our airwaves and our podcasts and on YouTube.
Yes.
Everybody will see them.
That was WRAL state government reporter Paul Spey. For all coverage of the new election bill, go to the NC Capitol section of our website, WRAL.com. I'm Elizabeth Holmes with the Daily Download. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle events, news, and headlines to help get you ready for the day. Sign up on our website.